thinking about and troubled by the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and a host of, the list goes on and on for years, um, of the victims of police brutality. And I was kind of asked to talk a little bit about my own experience in our community from this fall. And so I think a lot of you guys saw a post that I made on Facebook telling the story, but I'll kind of preface it as saying, this, like reiterating, this is our community. I think a lot of times it feels like these issues are distant in some way, but these are not distant. So my own experience was that this fall, I was coming home from work, and I parked in my driveway, and I was getting ready to walk inside my house, and I hear these whoop, whoop, whoop sirens, and the screech of tires. This police car swerved over, and so I'm kind of like turning and confused, and there's an officer that jumps out of his car, and he's got his hand on his gun, and he says, stop where you are, drop what's in your hands, and put your hands in the air. And he's just yelling at me, drop it, drop it, drop it, put your hands in the air. So obviously I have no idea what's going on, but of course I'm dropping the things in my hand. I'm slowly putting my hands in the air, and he's kind of yelling at me like, what are you doing? Where are you coming from? Like, what do you have? Like all this different stuff. And I'm, a little flustered. I'm trying to answer and say, this is my house. This is my house. I live here. This is my house, kind of over and over again. And he's saying that there's been break-ins and things like that. And he tells me that I can slowly reach for my wallet. And so I start doing that. And that's when a second officer kind of pulls up, and this officer kind of gets out of his car and walks over. And the first thing that I noticed about him is that he's giving the other officer a look that's kind of like, what are you doing? But he kind of is walking towards me, and he kind of comes kind of in between us while I'm kind of giving the other officer my wallet, and he's saying I fit the description of somebody that's breaking in. The second officer says, like, I'm so sorry about this, sir. You can put your hands down. So I'm just kind of putting my hands down slowly, and he's like, let me explain to you what's going on. There's somebody who's been doing break-ins, and the officer says he fits the description, the first officer, and the second officer says, I don't think it's him. He kind of shoots me a look and says, I don't think it's him. And so then the first officer kind of gives me a wallet back, and the second officer says, like, do you have any questions about what's going on? And this is totally off track from what I'm saying, but as I'm reflecting on this more and more, it makes me think of what I have heard described when people talk about sexual assault or being the victim of something. And I'm not in any way equating what I went through to sexual assault, but a lot of times they get asked the question, like, well, why didn't you do anything? Like, why didn't you say something in that moment? Or why didn't you fight back? Or why didn't you, those sort of things. Like in that moment, I think back and I'm like, oh, it would have been great to get a badge number or to say, like, you've, committed this disservice against me, all these different things. But in the moment, it's survival. In the moment, it's like, what is going on? It all is happening so fast. And so all I said was, can I go inside? And so he said yes, and that's what I did. And as I've retold the story a lot of times, and as I've told it, a lot of times I'll tell it and I'll be kind of laughing because it's just hard to process, how that was, how that happened so fast and was kind of just dramatic. Anyway, that's my story from this fall, and I wanted to talk today, in light of that story, about implicit bias and shame. And I think those things are kind of the same thing. The word bias stems from a Greek word that means oblique, like kind of to one side or slanted. And the word implicit is from a Latin word that means entwined. So like this slantedness entwined in like who we are, how we think. I think that's a pretty clean definition of what that means. And I think that police officer that I had an interaction with was biased against me as a Black man. And furthermore, I think that all of you who are listening, if you grew up in the United States, I think you are biased against me as a Black man. And I'll bring it home by saying that even me, as I'm talking as a Black man, am biased against me as a Black man. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by all of that. And nobody has explained this better than Hannah Gadsby. And so some of you guys might know who Hannah Gadsby is. She is a comedian, and she had a Netflix special called Nanette that was a smash hit. I mean, everybody saw it. I mean, if you didn't see it, that's okay. You didn't see it. She won a Peabody Award. I mean, it was kind of a hit. And it wasn't just a hit because she was really witty and funny, like comedians tend to be. It was a hit because it was this really raw, powerful, dramatic sermon. I'll call it a sermon on trauma. And so what you need to know about Hannah Gadsby is that she is a lesbian from the country of Tanzania. And those two things might not have any linkage in your mind because they didn't have anything in my mind either. But apparently, Tanzania was the country that had the harshest laws towards same-sex relationships maybe in the world, including like the death penalty and up to 21 years imprisonment for same-sex relationships up till 1997, which seems like how could that possibly be true? But 1997 was when those laws were finally abolished. And so in one section of the stand-up special, Hannah Gadsby is talking, and she's saying by the time she kind of grew up, I guess I should say, like, the laws that are made in any country are a symptom of two things: the people that are in power and the communities that are in that community or in that country. And so Hannah Gadsby grew up in that community. And so she says by the time that she kind of grew up and wanted to come out, she says it was too late. I was already homophobic. And I'll repeat that one more time. She says by the time she grew up and wanted to come out and do the things that she felt like she was kind of made to do, it was too late. She was already homophobic. I think the thing about bias is that it happens in the communities that we grow up in. I think we come up in bias. And so we could believe that we are maybe the least racist person, you know what I mean? Like that there's not a racist bone in our body, but how many times in our country have we seen depictions of Black people as thugs? Or how many times have we told, like, here are the neighborhoods you shouldn't go? Or how many times have we seen dangerous Black bodies in prison? Or how many times have we seen Academy Award level acting from a Black actor who's playing a drug dealer or a gangster or something? We grew up in a country where our heroes are mostly all white. And our history is mostly all white. And Black people show up kind of in slavery and then maybe once again in the civil rights movement. We have all kind of come up in this. And I wonder how many of us, including myself, would be able to say by the time we kind of awoke to how horrible racism is and how rampant it is, it was too late. We were already a little racist ourselves. I think we're terrified of biases because we don't want to be part of the problem. We don't want to sound insensitive. We don't want to be prejudiced. Like, nobody wants that, right? But I don't think we recognize that bias is something that's often given to us. And that's why I like to use the word shame, because shame is something that's given to us and internalized. And I think bias is just kind of shame in a direction. And notice I'm using the word we a lot because I think we as Black people aren't immune to that ourselves. Just like Hannah Gadsby, like wherever we come up in the absence of positive images or the presence of negative images and thoughts about even ourselves, it seeps inside of us. And then we are just in the cycle of perpetuating shame and bias over and over again. I think that officer was biased, as I said, and he couldn't perceive me as a homeowner arriving home after a long day of work, because how many times has he been exposed to that? How many times has he been exposed to the Black homeowner? Or when has being Black been allowed to be like the mundane? I feel like in our society, it's often like the Black celebrity or the Black delinquent, right? It's not the Black homeowner or the, just normal everyday Black worker. So today, I'm asking you to be honest with yourself and with me and with each other about how we are trained as a society. if we're being honest, we have deep-rooted toxic biases that have been drilled into us since the day we were born, and deep-rooted toxic shame that is inside of us about ourselves. And it just keeps getting handed to us over and over again. And it's not our fault that we have that. But I think it's our fault if we don't move forward and try to attack it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because I believe, like in all things, Jesus kind of shows us how to do that. And I'm going to do this through a story of a banquet, a story of a banquet that Jesus tells, a parable of a banquet. But in truth, I could do this with any story about Jesus pretty much ever. This is what he does over and over again throughout his entire ministry. So here's the story of the banquet. It says, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, I've just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me. Another said, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Still another said, I just got married, so I can't come. The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town. Bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Sir, the servant said, what you ordered has been done, but there is still room. Then the master told his servant, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will get a taste of my banquet. Here's the simple model that Jesus kind of had on repeat throughout his ministry. You find the people in society that we're being taught to be biased against, that we're taught are less than, and you give them the seat of honor. And Jesus did it all the time. He made a prostitute his party guest with wealthy religious leaders. He chose a tax collector for a place to stay on his travels. He told the story of a party being thrown by a father for what we would call like a good-for-nothing son. He let women follow and learn from him alongside men. He embraced the sick people that society sent away. He embraced the disruption of a disabled man who was brought to him while he was speaking. He said, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. Over and over and over again, the same thing. I think conversations about race in our country can get really big, really fast, which is makes sense, right? We need systemic change. We need to change laws. We need to change all those things. But we've needed systemic change since our country's inception. You know what I mean? The kingdom of heaven does not wait for the kingdom of the world. It just can't. It will never get there. And so let me get practical about how we dismantle racism in the style of Jesus. So number one, I think we have to be honest. I have a friend, John Evans, who says, he's a counselor, and he says the degree to which we can be healthy is the degree to which we can accept reality. If we're not honest about our own biases, fears, and shames, we'll never move past them. We'll never overcome them. So ask yourself hard questions. Do Black men feel more dangerous to you? Are Black women too intimidating? Is Black culture too loud? Are Black people largely a detriment to your community or your neighborhoods? Ask yourself hard question after hard question after hard question until you know like just how far you've been trained. And the same thing goes for me. Just how far we've been trained. I've been trained in my own mind. We can't be afraid of reality because that's the only way that we get healthy. And it's not our fault that we have a lot of these biases and shame because it's been handed to us, but we have to attack them head on. Number two is wherever you find those biases and shame, that's what gets the honor. That's what gets the seat of honor. So a great example of this would be, imagine if that officer had discovered in himself a bias that he has towards Black men, an assumption of guilt. And so he made a commitment that whenever on his rounds, when he pulled somebody over, when he had to make a stop, if it was a person of color, if it was a Black man especially, that he would go out of his way to de-escalate the situation. He'd go out of his way to be polite, that he'd go out of his way to make sure that he was not assuming guilt. And that might sound like, maybe ridiculous for some reason, but that's literally how we interact with white men in our society, right? Like that's the same interaction, that you don't assume guilt. You say like, okay, what's going on? Like, who is this person? Let me ask, a question, right? But you have to do the proactive work of, that's where my biases lie. So I have to be over the top of giving responding with honor. So if you discover a bias in yourself that you kind of think Black people are typically less intelligent, those are the people that you ask for advice at your work. Those are the people that you say, like, can you weigh in on this decision with me? Can you, partner with them? If you think like, oh, the Black kids in our neighborhood are kind of a disruption and they're dangerous, those are the kids you give popsicles to every day this summer. You know what I mean? And you get to know them, right? We give them the seat of honor. And do this with yourself and shame as well. I know I'm getting close. I might be a little over, David. I'm sorry. But I've started doing this last summer. One thing that Black people make jokes about all the time is like how dark we get. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it's bad to be dark and it's good to be light, essentially. And it's jokes, right? We make a lot of jokes growing up, like, oh, you're so dark right now, blah, blah, blah. And it sounds like just jokes. But what I discovered even last summer was, thanks, Sean. What I discovered even last summer was that's internalized shame for me, because I'm like an 89% cacao dark chocolate man. You know what I mean? And so starting last summer, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to get in the sun as much as possible. I'm going to take my dark skin. I'm going to make it as dark as I want. And, you're not even going to tell me from my shirt. I don't care. That's how I'm made, right? That's who I am. That's finding where my own shame and biases are and attacking it by giving it honor. Like, that's who I'm made to be. That's my skin, right? That's something we have to do with ourselves and with the world around us. Number 3 is that we need to relearn history. And that's kind of a strange one, but can we really identify our biases and give honor where it's needed if we don't know just how much we've been trained, right? My summer skin is a good example. If you would have asked me before last summer and said, like, what do you think about these jokes? I'm like, they're jokes, whatever. But then when I start re-examining it and saying, like, no, that's internalized shame, that I don't want to be dark for some reason, it changes how I interact with it. We have to do that with our personal histories and with the histories of our societies, because, like I said, we don't learn the full history of what's happening in our country, what has happened, and how we're being trained. The Netflix documentary 13th is a good start for this. I think it has a lot of information about just how much intentional and subconscious programming is going on in our brains about the Black community specifically. And I know today I'm talking most about the Black community today because I'm Black and because that's the moment that we're living in. But this is true about any number of biases that we have. We have biases toward all sorts of communities, all sorts of people. I have a friend that says he doesn't like when people say learned. He says, I'm learning. You have to learn and relearn and relearn. You just have to keep doing it. And so this might not be a feel-good sermon because I'm saying, like, you're biased, and I'm saying I'm biased. I'm saying we're biased. I think that's reality. We have shame inside of us. I think that's reality. But I guess the ask would be that you would have the courage to say it, to make it known, and to go into, like, metaphorically, the alleys and ditches of our mind and find these things, these biases, and start giving those people the honor in our own lives. And in that way, we change our communities, we change our systems, and we change our families, and we rewrite our histories. So that's all from me.